Okay, we're live on YouTube when you guys are ready.
Ready?
Yep.
Okay. I'm ready to go. Welcome to the North Logan Planning Commission meeting.
Okay,
February.
we're live on
2nd.
YouTube when you guys are ready.
Okay.
Yep.
Everybody's had a great celebration today. Ready to go? Today, yeah. Welcome to the North Logan Planning Commission meeting.
Okay,
February.
we're live on
2nd.
YouTube when you guys are ready.
Okay.
Yep.
Everybody's had a great celebration today. Ready to go? Today, yeah. Welcome to the North
Looks like we just make sure this is on the record here. Okay, so the second bullet point, building codes. With any structure, it has to meet the building code in order to get a certificate of occupancy. However, this particular section calls out a couple of things in particular that need to be reviewed by the building department before we can classify detached accessory dwelling unit as habitable. And you'll see them here, A through G. We're talking about emergency rescue and escape openings, smoke and carbon monoxide detectors, arc fault circuit breakers, ground fault circuit breakers, making sure you have adequate egress and that egress is not through a garage. The only egress isn't through a garage. And a few other things that when and if we permit these accessory dwelling units, we would want to have the building department verify that these particular life safety items are achieved in that structure. Okay. A couple of things to note here. This particular structure is pre-existing. There's quite a bit of garage space on the lower level. And then on the upper level, there's a 2-bedroom apartment that again is pre-existing. And then there's some unused space that was built as a studio for a dance studio, but it's not part of the dwelling unit. It's bonus space, but it's not part of that rental space. The applicant has clarified that they don't plan to modify that space. It's pre-existing. Okay. This next section, section 3, has to do with the size of a dwelling unit, accessory dwelling unit, and then the occupancy requirements. The occupancy requirements here are that it's specific that the owner of a property that has a detached accessory dwelling unit owner occupy that property. So they have to be residing on that property. Otherwise, if there were 2 unrelated families on the same property, it would be multifamily, which the zoning doesn't allow. So this particular section is specific that in order to permit a detached accessory dwelling unit, that owner reside on the property as long as that dwelling unit is being occupied. The other item here is size, and the size depends on the configuration. If you have a cabin in the backyard, for example, this section limits that to 1,000 square feet. So a detached dwelling in the backyard is limited to 1,000. But there are some ratios in here that need to be considered. So a detached accessory dwelling unit cannot exceed 50% of the footprint of the primary residence and its garage. So the footprint as a whole, we need to make sure the detached dwelling is no more than half the size of that primary residence. Okay. So the single family residence in this instance, along with the garage, is about 3,800 square feet. The detached accessory building itself is about the same. It's about 3,800 square feet. The dwelling unit within is 1,500 square feet. So the dwelling unit itself is not above that 50% ratio. Now there's some language in here that is a little bit ambiguous. It's not straightforward. And if we were to have a brand new structure come before us where we have to review it and say, how big is this detached accessory dwelling unit? There is some leeway for interpretation here. The code is not specifically clear. Where on this last sentence here, see if I can, I'm going to download this real quick so we're not looking at a different view. Okay, so we talked about this ratio of the dwelling unit not exceeding 50% of the building footprint up to a maximum gross area of 1,000 square feet. So that basically means if you've got a 2,000 square foot primary residence, then you would be able to achieve 1,000 square foot detached unit. But if you had a smaller than 2,000 square foot home, let's say you had like a 1,500 square foot home, which also includes a garage, then you'd be limited to a 750 square foot detached accessory dwelling unit. Okay, this is where the language gets a little bit interesting. So if the accessory dwelling unit is built entirely over a garage for the primary structure, the entire structure shall not exceed a maximum gross area of 1,500 square feet. So now we know that this structure is 3,800 square feet, right? The dwelling unit within is 1,500 square feet and it's pre-existing. It was built in 2015, 2016. Now, I don't know that we can say that there's precedent per se, nor are we bound by precedent, but somebody looking at this in the past had approved this, and it's a pre-existing structure. Where if we were to look at it today, where we would say the entire structure needs to be no more than 1,500 square feet, that's where maybe there's some interpretation there in the code. It would appear that the code has been interpreted in the past to allow for what is pre-existing to have occurred. And going back in time is hard to determine how and when and who made that determination, but we have an existing structure here.
So Scott, I actually interpreted the code differently than I think what I heard you say, but can I just ask for clarification?
Please do.
So when it talks about 50% of the building footprint, including the garage, I thought that was actually the footprint, the square footage of the footprint on the ground. So if you have 3,000 square feet of living space, but that's across 2 floors, each of which is 1,500 square feet, then 1,500 square feet, it would have to be 50% of the 1,500, not the 3,000.
So you'd be at what, 750?
Am I interpreting, is that what you're saying, or?
That is a way to interpret it, and I've read it that way myself, where you would have a footprint of 750 for the garage on the lower level, and then a 750 square foot apartment on the floor above. That is a way that it has been read as well. The other question in this is when we look at over a garage for the primary structure, this is a detached garage for the primary structure, right? So we're saying that this is detached from the home, whether on the side yard or the rear yard, and that this unit can be built entirely over a garage, not to exceed 1,500 square feet. When you look at the requirement just for a detached unit being allowed up to 1,000, it makes you wonder if this language, maybe the intent was that if you have it over a garage, that then you could go up to 15 instead of just 1,000. So there's some, you can read this 3 or 4 different ways and think of it maybe 3 or 4 different ways. But the plain language is probably what should be looked at when approving these going forward. Now,
So in this specific case, the 3,800 square feet that's pointed out here, is that the total living space of the primary dwelling unit on the plot, or is it?
that is
The
the
footprint.
footprint of
Okay.
the primary residence plus the
With the
garage.
garage.
That doesn't
Okay.
account for any basement space or, loft space of any
Okay.
kind. Okay. Now, when I very first read this, I read it a little bit differently because I come from another municipality that allowed for accessory dwelling units within a larger structure. As long as the dwelling unit didn't exceed a certain number of square feet, the structure was allowed to be bigger, but the dwelling unit within had to be, at or below a certain square footage. So when I first read this, it didn't click in my mind immediately. Hey, maybe there's a different way you could read this language, and maybe there's, a different way to interpret it. So it's interesting because this is an existing structure with an existing apartment approved in the past by a previous owner. And now we've got, a new application for conditional use permit going forward in an existing structure, not being proposed to be modified. So that there's some struggle there, I think, for us to look at this and say, are we bound to push forward something that was approved in the past? That may have met the intent of the language, may not have. But that's the discussion we can have in more detail if you'd like. But this particular section of the code has to do with that square footage in the area allowed for an accessory dwelling unit, as well as the occupancy requirement, meaning the owner has to reside and occupy the property itself. Okay. Okay.
Just a point of clarification, you said property. Does the owner have to occupy the primary residence
So
or
that
the property?
that's where the code doesn't explicitly state yes or no.
Yeah.
there's a section in the code that may allude to that. If you look in the intent section
Yeah.
of the conditional use or the conditional use requirements for a detached accessory unit, there are a couple of things in there that clarify the intent of allowing such a
Right.
structure. But it also goes on, if you read more, where it indicates that, you may want to have one of these to provide for affordable housing, to provide additional housing stock. So that it's not explicit in the code to say where the owners reside. Okay, number
But it could
4,
be interpreted in the intent
potentially,
as you
Yep.
read that one.
as you read it, yeah. Number B here. Okay, sorry, number 4 is where there may be other conditions that the planning commission can impose to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the occupants of the neighborhood on these. So that's kind of a side note. The detached accessory dwelling unit is approved by the planning commission, so you are the land use authority on this type of a decision. It is an administrative decision, it's not legislative. What is interesting about this particular use is that the conditional use code indicates that typically we don't have a public hearing and there's no public noticing sent out for conditional use. With exception to this particular use, our code seems to change for this particular topic. So to follow process, staff, sent out public notices and we're having a public hearing tonight to ensure we follow process. Okay. Okay, conditional use permit is required. We've talked about that. And then item D is requiring that this unit be a permanent structure. We don't want to have teepees or covered wagons in the backyard being used as accessory dwelling units. This particular building is a traditional foundation, stick frame, gable roof that matches the single family home. And then E is to help it blend into the neighborhood. So we want to have similar architecture, similar, finishing materials, which as you'll see in the staff report below, it does follow that design standard of the primary home. There's a couple of images of when the building inspection department inspected it through its course of construction. But you'll see here, the unit itself is matching the home. Now, this is the structure in question. The actual apartment of this structure is the back half of the top level. The front half is that unused studio space, and then we've got the garage underneath that is part of what the primary home utilizes for storage of various materials. Okay, that's, I guess, in a nutshell, the staff report. Now, if you look in, let's see this page here. We did issue public notice. My star got moved slightly. The property is actually located where my cursor is, but the code requires we send out a public notice within 600 feet of the property. So that's what that blue buffer is. And everybody in this area received a notice. Okay, lastly, if this particular use is something that you want to move forward on with an approval, a conditional approval, staff has provided some conditions that we would recommend you approve subject to these conditions, one of which is that the parking be on site at all times. The owner needs to schedule a building inspection through the building department to verify they meet all those building code requirements. And then a requirement in the code is that the owner needs to submit a notarized acknowledgement indicating that the owner is aware of and agrees to abide by the owner occupancy requirement, that they're not going to turn around and rent that unit to an unrelated party and by which creating a multifamily type of a property. And then lastly, the findings here are the findings that are required of the planning commission to find in the approval of a conditional use permit. So number 1, the proposed use is necessary or desirable and will contribute to the general well-being of the community. 2, the use will not be detrimental to the health, safety, or general welfare of the persons residing or working in the vicinity or injurious to property or improvements in the vicinity. 3, the proposed use will comply with the regulations of this ordinance. And 4, the proposed use is in harmony with the intent of the master plan. So if you would like to move on this, those are some recommended conditions and findings. Now, you are obviously welcome to talk about this and make your own findings or additional findings to go forward. As a point of clarity, because this is a conditional use permit, it is an administrative item. The only way in which you can deny a conditional use permit is if you have findings of law or findings of fact where this does not meet the code and that there are no reasonable conditions that can mitigate its impact to its neighbors. Those are the only ways in which you can move to deny a conditional use permit. Does have any questions on that?
Any questions? We can talk in a minute. All right. We'll open up our public hearing. We'll have open up a public hearing. Before you begin, please state your name for the record. Please speak into the microphone so that your comments can be recorded. Please limit your statements to 2 minutes. If you're also speaking on behalf of others, you may ask the chairman for more time. Please phrase your opinions in the form of statements, not questions. A public hearing is your opportunity to express your opinions to the Planning Commission. It is not a time to ask questions and expect dialogue between yourself and the commission or city staff. Please address your comments to the commission, not to the public. The commission might ask questions about your comments in order for them to better understand you. If you have questions or need to discuss an issue, please meet with the Planning Commission members or the appropriate city staff member before the public hearing where dialogue can take place. You may provide a written statement as your input for a hearing. You may read your entire statement or summarize it. The 2-minute limit applies. You may provide a copy of a written statement to the city recorder. He will make copies for the commission. Written comments, if a copy is provided, become a part of the public record, but are not included in the minutes of the meeting. All right, let me get a timer. Do we have any comments from the public? Come on up to the microphone, please. Tell us your name.
Greetings and thanks for the time today. My name is Ryan Seeley. And I've written my comments down, but I will be within the 2 minutes. As an adjacent property owner, I object to the issuance of a conditional use permit for an accessory dwelling unit on the basis that the structure in question may not qualify for granting an ADU based on its size. Furthermore, issuing a conditional use permit will allow the ADU to be used for purposes in direct opposition to the purposes documented in the ADU ordinance. I have prepared a letter outlining my concerns and will submit that after the meeting. I'd like to briefly paraphrase the first article of the code governing ADUs. The purpose of permitting an accessory dwelling unit is to A, provide homeowners with a means of obtaining, through tenants in an accessory dwelling unit, rental income in homes they might otherwise be forced to leave. B, add inexpensive rental units to the housing stock. C, make housing units available to moderate and or lower income households who might otherwise have difficulty finding housing. D, develop housing units in single-family neighborhoods that serve the needs of residents. Purpose A states that the homeowner obtains rental income, quote, through tenants in an accessory dwelling unit, unquote. The code dictates here that the tenant reside in the ADU and not the primary residence. The proposed conditional use, however, has this the other way around, with the homeowner in the small ADU and the numerous tenants in the large primary residence. Also, based on use of the property, evidence since late last year, the kind of rental that will be enabled if the city grants the requested conditional use permit will go directly against all 4 purposes of the municipal code on ADUs. I therefore object to the city granting a conditional use permit on the basis that the purposes of the requested ADU go contrary to those written in the municipal code. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Whoops, sorry. I'm done talking.
Good evening. My name is Tim McKenzie. I live across the street from the subject property, and I thought that was a very good description. I agree with everything they said there. I just, what I want to make clear is that it is opposite, I think, of what the intent of a accessory dwelling unit is the owners are going to live in there and use the primary, residence as a VRBO. It's currently listed as a 28 person plus VRBO. When it's rented out, last week when it was rented out, there were 15 vehicles parked in the driveway. On the street, in the driveway. I don't think it's consistent with the family nature of this neighborhood to have essentially a small hotel across the street. And I don't think that the dwelling permit that they're requesting is consistent with the purpose of it. And I feel like we're setting a precedence here. I'm an empty nester, I've got a nice house across the street, but I could build a house, in the backyard too and do the same thing and turn it into a VRBO, and we could take our nice quiet street and just turn it into, a hotel street. That's essentially, what's happened next door. So I think it has opportunity to be very loud, very dangerous. It's a quiet neighborhood that is no longer quiet because it's 28 plus people is what it's advertised as. So,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you, Mr. Kinsey.
Hi, my name is Janessa Seeley, and I wanted to speak to the last item in 12C-507. It says the proposed use is in harmony with the intent of the master plan. And I do have a copy, and I'll leave it here, of the declaration of the CCRs for the Deer Hollow subdivision. And it says this is for the purpose of protecting the value and desirability of the properties, which I feel this would go in direct conflict with. Also, in these CCRs, it says no commercial activities of any kind whatever shall be conducted in any building or on any portion of the properties. It also says no noxious or offensive activity shall be carried on upon any part of the properties, nor shall anything be done thereon which may be or may become an annoyance or nuisance to the neighborhood, or which shall in any way interfere with the quiet enjoyment of each of the owners, or which shall in any way increase the rate of insurance. And I feel like that is what is happening when Jeff brought up the comment of where the tenants would be living versus where the primary residence would be.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Janae Hopkins, and I'm related to Eli and Joel. And I personally reside on the property currently. So my comments would just be that this structure and the permits that are in place predate our purchase of this property. When we purchased the property, we were under the impression, came to the city, spoke to them about the situation, have been in communication with the city all along and with the realtors. Never had any idea that neighbors had such a problem with this unit beforehand, obviously. This is something that maybe should have been brought up with the previous residents as well, but it was permitted. That's what we purchased it in intending to use it in that way. And we're open to communication with you and with neighbors and have been open to that and welcome your questions. Do you have any questions for me?
Oh, I will.
Okay,
We'll wait till.
We'll wait till after the public
Okay.
hearing. Thank you.
thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, no? Okay. Careful.
Hi, I'm Susan McKenzie. I live across the street from the dwelling. The intent of the original dwelling when it was built was as a secondary. It was never intended to be a primary dwelling. And it was never used as an income property or a rental. And if I speak to last weekend, when there were 15 cars in the street, the plows were not able to come through our street and plow when we had the major snowstorm because of the cars that were in the street. I also was not able to get to snow blow my sidewalk or the street to get out where the plow pulled in from the street onto the sidewalk. I was out using my snow blower when the cars were exiting and they were pulling into my driveway to turn around to get out into the street. This is not the neighborhood for a Airbnb, for a rental property, that the dwelling in the back was never intended for a primary residence. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Eli Hopkins. I live at the apartment. I just need to clarify a few things. We're talking about the ADU, but I do need to clarify. I understand there's a lot of emotion. I was contacted when there were 3 cars in the street that I saw. I never saw 15. So I don't know where that number came from. There were a lot of cars in the driveway. This was an active LDS family having the funeral services in town for their mom, who was a local. They were not partying. They were hanging out. Some cousins came, and unbeknownst to me, they parked in the street. As soon as I was called, I asked them to move their cars, which they did immediately. I then spoke to another neighbor who then came and cleared the street. We're here to help. We're not here to fight. And I appreciate all the emotion, and I don't know where all the fear comes from. I really don't. I'm trying to help. I'm trying to understand, but I need you guys to know that this is based on fear right now and not a lot of facts. And I'm sorry that there were 3 cars in the road. I really am. And I'm sorry that it couldn't be plowed. We fixed it. And that's our intent, is to help. We want to be a benefit. It's a family fun location, and that's what it's called. I understand people are worried, well, who are you going to bring in? There's so many what ifs as far as neighbors and what they could be doing. I get some of the fears, I do, but I think we've proved at this point that we're trying to help, and anyone that's come to us, we've been open and honest and helpful this whole time. We really have. We've not hidden anything. And if anyone would come to us and say, here's a concern, can you help resolve it? Absolutely, we'll help resolve it. We'll talk to you about it. We're not closed-minded. We've talked to a lot of the neighbors, and anytime we've introduced, we've been very open and talked about what we're doing. But 3 cars parked in the street and we're acting like the world ended. I don't understand yet. I really don't. I fixed the problem. And so beyond that, beyond the fears, what facts do we have? That's not why we're here. We're here to talk about the ADU and if we're allowed to use it. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name's David Benson. I've got what might seem as a minor point that's almost tangential to the major discussion here, but a plain reading of the municipal code 12C-515-2, paragraph 1 says there shall be provided at least 2 off-street parking spaces for the detached unit. I don't see in the code, and I may be mistaken, but I don't see a requirement to at all times have all vehicles parked off the street, especially not for the primary residence. I have plenty of parking off street for my own home, but often we park on the street for various reasons. So it seems like the staff recommendation number 1 there might be a little too much as far as the plain reading of the code goes. And I apologize if I've misread that, but just a minor point that I wanted to bring up. Thank you.
Anyone else?
And I live in the neighborhood there. And we do, I think, have some other properties in the neighborhood where people do rent space, you know, they have.
Sorry, I can't hear you very well. Are you able to speak a little bit?
Sure.
Yeah, you gotta have that
We
mic.
do have other
Thank you.
properties in the neighborhood, I think, where people rent a component of, you know, in a separate structure, apartment, whatever. But those are sort of different, from my perspective, those are tenants. And those people actually live there. They're usually under a lease for months, if not years. And they all have parking spaces that are off of the street. 28 people, it's hard to have, you know, enough transportation for 28 people. I think there are limitations with the property in terms of parking for that many people, unless you're using a bus. But I don't have fear. I have concerns about safety, particularly with the snowstorm. and not being able to maneuver in the street for the snow plows and for other people, even in their own yards. So I don't think this is a fear thing. This is more of I think a safety issue. If there were a fire, if we had fire trucks and you've got all these cars parked out on the street there, it could be a potential problem in terms of safety.
Thank you.
Yeah, Chad Albrecht. I'm just a neighbor in the neighborhood as well. I know this is a really delicate issue. We have 5 children, high school, junior high, and elementary school. My wife and I are also concerned about this. A few years ago, I had a colleague up from Juarez, Mexico, and I was driving him through our neighborhood in North Logan, and he looked at me, he said, "The parents here are so irresponsible." And I said, "Why is that?" And he said, "Because the kids are just playing in the neighborhood." And I looked at him, I said, "No, you don't understand. This is North Logan. This is one of the safest places in the world." And, you know, having people come and go, it puts a little bit of fear, and whether it's perceived fear or whether it's, you know, even if it's not real, when we drive by and we see 15 cars, or we drive by and people are coming and going, as a parent, you're just a little bit more cautious letting your kids play. And so I just wanted to share, you know, that experience, that we love the family values of North Logan. We want to see it stay as a family-centered unit. My wife and I have no problem if they rent out part of their house, but having people come and go is a huge worry for us. Yeah, I guess that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Rachel Willis, and I just want to second what Chad said and also what Ryan Seeley said. And I'm just like, I don't know, if we could just talk to them and be like, hey, could you not have so many in your, 28 does seem a lot. When you're in a single family residency area. I don't think, like, what single family has that many people at their home. And so if I'm just saying, if you do want an Airbnb, just make it like a single family, not no more, than 8 people or something. And then that was a huge garage that they built. So yeah, I was there. I'm their neighbor 2 doors down anyways. And so, and I think their purpose was, I think she had a dance studio, like he was saying, but it is interesting. Like, the thing is definitely not to code according to what he read in the code, to note that. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Anyone else? This is your last chance. Speak.
It'd be on YouTube.
That's right. All right. If there's no more, anyone that wants to speak, we'll close the public hearing. And now we'll open it up to the commission to talk about this.
Nan?
Yes.
Could I have Scott, like, you clarify something for me?
Sure.
I'm looking on 2. Sorry. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
I'll learn. When I look at 2G, the second paragraph, when it says and remember, I'm new about Airbnb things, but the residence, single family dwelling, including the detached accessory dwelling unit, shall be considered single family residence.
Rather than a duplex, right?
Well,
Yeah.
in a rental property, that's what.
Yeah.
But I mean, they're both, like they said, both of them are considered single family dwellings. And like I said, I'm not up to date on what Airbnbs are allowed, but I'm just wondering about those 2 places that say they both are considered single family
Yeah.
residents.
Real quick, just for everybody in the room and also the commission, we need to be careful in this because the conversation surrounding a short-term rental is not at all a part of this agenda item. Now, folks may be aware that the primary residence has been rented as a short-term rental. This particular action, this particular consideration is solely for the detached accessory dwelling unit. Any consideration of the short-term rental use needs to be put aside. There is a process and a licensing process for that use when and if it is submitted to the city. However, this particular use, we need to be careful about not mixing the two uses in our deliberation, okay?
So when it says single family dwelling, that's just means.
Yep. So what it's basically saying is if we have a detached accessory dwelling unit, we don't want to have a separate utility meter, a separate utility
that.
bill. We want to make sure that this is still single family zoning, right? The primary family still resides on the property. And we're not turning it into multifamily where we have a second standalone unit that has no single family component to it. So actually, I'm not explaining that very well, where the primary owner resides
not.
on the property. Okay, that's the intent between a detached accessory dwelling unit, is that it's still primarily owned by the primary owner. Okay.
So Scott, I think the only, like you say, we're looking at the ADU, the conditional use permit for the ADU right now.
Correct.
But if the ADU conditional use permit is being sought for what, depending on how the city interprets Airbnb, VRBO, if it's a commercial use or not, we still table that and just look at this as just the
Correct.
ADU.
That's right.
Because it's not a condition of the ADU.
Right.
It's not,
Right.
it's not in this part of the code. There's a whole nother section somewhere else for short-term.
Yep.
re-
Totally different
rental,
licensing
but for
process.
The conditional use permit, it's just the conditions that are outlined in.
Correct.
So what we have to consider are all the things that the staff that we've just read about. The ADU requirements, the suggestions from the staff. That's what we get to talk about here and consider.
So. Is it okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. So I just want to, I do want to understand, I want to talk a little bit about the code and the structure, itself. I also want to talk about the intent. So just so we understand. So my understanding is that the accessory dwelling, the apartment back behind above the garage is the accessory dwelling, and that's the intent is the owner would reside in that accessory dwelling with the intent of renting out the primary residence. Is that, am I understanding that correct? Okay, okay. Oh,
Yeah,
I'm sorry. I
Go to
should
the
have
mic.
asked you to.
Want to go to the mic?
I heard you, but no one else.
Yeah,
did, so
we
thank
forget
you.
that we can hear you and Marie can't.
But Marie will always let me know.
Currently, yes, the
Okay.
owner, my husband and I are living in the apartment because we are empty nesters. It's just two of us. We don't need to live in an 8-bedroom home with, 4 bathrooms. We just, a 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom is plenty for us.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. That's my first wanted to clarify. The next thing that I want to clarify, and this is in section 3. And I don't know how else to interpret this, but clearly just how it's written. So in fact, yeah, you got it up there. So I'm going to start with the proposed detached accessory dwelling unit shall not exceed 50% of the building footprint of the single family dwelling. Now, pull up the GIS picture. Or you could, it's in the staff notes, sorry.
Did you want-
I just want to see
Exhibit
the
A.
overhead,
For exhibit.
the roof lines. And we know the primary resident footprint, including garage, 3,800 square feet. I took the GIS and measured, I don't know, we're like 3,500 square feet for the detached.
So yeah, if you measure the eaves and everything, it's 38. So it's probably less than
So,
38.
yeah, okay, all right,
Yep.
I guess 3,500, but regardless.
Mhm.
So I don't know how else to interpret that. The proposed detached accessory dwelling unit shall not exceed 50% of the building footprint of the single family dwelling. And then up to the 1,000, and that's the first. The second one is that last sentence, and this is probably what gives me the most trouble. If the accessory dwelling unit is built entirely over a garage, for the primary structure,
The garage for the primary structure.
garage for the primary structure, the entire structure shall not exceed a maximum gross area of 1,500 square feet. I don't know how else to interpret that. I don't know what the intent was when the language was, drafted or written. I just don't know how else to interpret that. And so I guess I'm curious as to this, how the staff came up with their interpretation that was. And that's an honest curiosity. I'm trying to be open with it. When I read it, it seems pretty clear to me when it says the entire structure shall not exceed.
But Jeff, is that last sentence even applicable because it's not built over the garage of the primary structure?
Well, that's a whole nother
Yeah.
part, but we're talking about a detached accessory dwelling. And where this was in the code for a detached accessory dwelling, I'm interpreting in that as the
detached.
garage is being used or owned by whoever's in the primary structure. So I kind of tiptoed by that one, but I'm struggling with how we get around with the entire structure shall not exceed a maximum gross area of 1,500 square feet.
Would you like my opinion on that?
Yes.
I'm genuinely curious.
Yes.
So on this sentence here, the proposed detached accessory dwelling unit shall not exceed 50% of the building footprint. So we're talking about the dwelling unit itself, and we know that the dwelling unit is not the entirety of the accessory building. That was my interpretation. Okay, 1,500 square feet it's not more than half the size of the primary home and its garage. That was upon my first reading of that. Okay. Now the other one, this is interesting.
Well, I don't want to pass this up. Because I'm having trouble. So I looked at the sketch. And how do we just define what's part of that dwelling? So I'm looking at the floor plan.
Yeah, it's exhibit.
There is it.
Right, so,
Yeah, exhibit
so
B.
we've got approximately, well, I don't know what the dimensions are, 40 by something. So, but this,
30.
we're saying that the dance studio is unused. So what says it's part of a unit or it's not part of the unit?
Yep.
Especially if your main residence is now above the
And
garage.
how is, I'm gonna ask you a question, sorry. How is this accessed, this dance studio? Is it accessed directly from this apartment?
If I can point, so
Please do.
I'll speak
Go.
and then I'll point.
Great.
So there's stairs going up on one side. And it leads to this door.
Okay.
This is the loft area, then the door, loft here, the door to here. So they have the same corner here. But then that's a separate door and that's a separate door. This has an exterior door and that's an exterior door. Again, this was pre-built before we
Mhm.
got here, used before we got here, so I can't explain how or why they did it, just
Sure,
that's
okay.
what it looks like. But you're welcome to come over and check it out too.
And let
Okay.
me get this straight too while you're there. You're living in the accessory dwelling
The 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom, yes.
right now.
Do we have any objective evidence of the square footage of the actual ADU being proposed other than this hand-drawn sketch?
We do not. So I didn't have any building permit plans to corroborate this with. The building department only keeps records for a few number of years before they cycle them out, so that we weren't able to pull the permit plans from this structure.
Are we allowed to?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh.
Yeah, I was just going to point out that if we're using the analysis of the primary residence and the garage for 1 square footage, it would make sense that you use the secondary residence and the garage in the analysis, right? Just to compare apples to apples. Anyway, thank
To
you.
be consistent, I would see it that way. Okay, so that right there is troubling with me. This, and I'm not trying to call it out and say, oh, I don't believe, but it's just really hard for me if I look at the intent of what I think the intent of this code is and what it's trying to do or prevent. So summary from my points, I'm I'm going to start with the first thing, the reason that we have conditional use permits. And I know that this, I don't know what it was before. I don't even know it was conditionally used permitted before, but I know it's before me now. So there's a reason that we have them come back. And that's so that we can understand what the new occupant or owner is going to do. We have an opportunity to review and evaluate the code that's before us. I'm struggling with the intent of this being an accessory dwelling, just for the fact of the name accessory dwelling. I would see the primary residence would be the primary residence. I would expect that to be the primary residence. That's the intent. And so that's my first problem with this conditional use permit is the intent. And the second is this code in 3, that I believe that the size of it does not meet the requirement of if we throw everything out and we just go with the 1,500 square feet, it exceeds the structure's too big for that. So there's my three.
Any more?
things.
That's it?
Yep, I'm done talking.
Good, Jeff.
Jeff, I kind of agree with you. I just wonder who determined the unincluded space?
We don't know.
Do you know what I'm saying? Do you understand what I'm saying?
I
Because,
think that's where I'm troubled with it.
because,
How do we not know that it's?
I mean, it could have storage, it could have anything, but what makes it unincluded in the
When
total?
it's a finished space.
That's my question.
This is from the applicant indicating what space is resided in, what is considered part of that dwelling unit versus what is not part of the dwelling unit, what is still accessory to the primary residence. So this is the section of the building that was submitted to us as being that dwelling space.
So it was
So-
submitted as that's the dwelling space for the primary residence?
No, for the accessory dwelling
ADU.
unit.
That's, no, but I meant the unincluded
unincluded-
space, who, if
So
you're
that
not
there's-
counting it for the accessory dwelling, are you counting the square footage of that for the primary
It'd be part
residence?
of the primary residence, it'd be part of an accessory building that is used by the primary residence.
So we're to assume that the pink space is used by those who are in the primary residence.
It's intended to be used by those in the primary residence. Now, what is being requested is that the space in white up there is the dwelling unit. That is what is being requested as the accessory dwelling unit, the
So-
occupied space.
So Scotty, I guess I'm still with that section 3. If we can just assume that the square footage in this hand-drawn plot is correct, that still puts us at about 1,500 square feet for the white space that's being proposed here, which it exceeds the 1,000 square foot maximum unless it's above the garage of the primary residence, which
Right.
this is not.
Well, the
Depending on
question
how you
then is-
interpret that, I
Primary
guess.
Is it the
Structure.
attached garage or is it the detached
Yeah,
garage? for
so that's the
primary residence?
ambiguity,
Then that
but
becomes,
The code isn't clear on that. You're right.
yeah, that's
Any other comments? I have to say that my two concerns, what was your third concern?
Oh, my first, it was a point. And that's just why I recognize that it may have been conditionally permitted before.
And we don't
But there's a
know.
reason that it comes back for us.
Right.
And all I can talk to is what's before me.
And my big concern is the intent. I don't know what I think about the intent of what this is going to become. And the size is the other thing that I have some numbers in front of me to go by. And it doesn't meet. It's more than we have required. So those are my two concerns also.
Yep.
And of course, the safety of the neighborhood is another concern of mine. So those are the things I'm coming from. I would have a hard time to grant this with those two concerns in my head.
My
agree.
is back, I think the same thing as the others. We're flipping primary and secondary residence. And I'm troubled with that. That all of a sudden the bigger house becomes a little house and the little house becomes the big house, primary thing. And I'm not sure that's the intent of what our regulations are for, or does it meet the regulations that we have there for the conditional use permit and the safety. If we're having that as an Airbnb or whatever the other designations are, that troubles me in
You
a,
can't consider that.
We
Airbnb.
can't
okay,
consider it,
can't
but,
do that. All right.
You can't.
but we can
Don't talk
consider.
about it.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't say that. So
No.
strike that. But
Yeah.
the that flipping of the residence primary and secondary, that bothers me. I don't like that.
So, but we are allowed to flip them. Are we, Scott, so we're allowed to flip them and say this accessory dwelling unit is now the primary, like we're fine to say that because then it doesn't fit the code. So either way, it's kind of a, that,
Well, there's not anything in the code that says that the owner shall reside in the primary
Okay.
residence. There's some references that, say, well, how to explain it? There's a reference that indicates that the use of it should be for tenants providing for rental income, but it doesn't say thou shalt live in the primary residence if you're going to have a detached accessory dwelling unit.
so then we say this is the primary and then we need to make sure it fits the footprint,
this
which
number
that's
needs-
numbers.
Right.
So then these
Too
numbers
big.
will have to be viewed and that's where
And the
I'm
numbers
also
don't work.
having a, if that is, if we need to swap that and have that be the primary, because that's what's taking place, then
So
we
the
need.
classification here wouldn't necessarily change. The primary home is what was built first, right? The primary home meets all the setbacks of a primary residence. The accessory building was built secondary and it meets the setbacks for a secondary building. So it's not that we can flip classifications on it, but what the code does say is that if we approve a detached accessory dwelling unit, that dwelling unit can be rented to an unrelated family. It doesn't say it has to be the owners as the family that resides in that unit. So the code doesn't give us clear direction on who shall reside in which unit.
So Scott, I always thought, when we talk about a detached ADU, I always thought that we are talking about the whole structure itself. It seems weird that you could just arbitrarily draw a line in a large detached ADU and say, we're only going to occupy this 1,000 square
Yeah.
feet, so we meet the code. I mean, how do you enforce that otherwise when there's 2,000 other square feet
Yeah.
that you've drawn a line in there?
That the enforcement's another question for sure. What is being portrayed to us and requested is that space is what they are classifying as a detached accessory dwelling within the accessory building. So, but I understand your concern of saying, well, how far, what prevents those residents from utilizing the entire space?
So you can section off a detached building, a part of that as the detached ADU without the whole building being considered
That's what they're
the
suggesting.
detached ADU. I know that's what they're suggesting. I don't know if that's
The
really the
code
intent of
doesn't,
the code.
this code doesn't state, whether you can or can't. There are codes I do know that allow for accessory dwellings within larger buildings.
Hmm.
That's not ours. So it's not unheard of, but it has no bearing on this decision.
Okay.
So I do, well,
Because
I was
we
just
just
gonna
have-
say, and that may be the intent of some of the language in there where it talks about footprint and entire structure. It's not
There's not a
parsing off
sentence.
something so that.
Yeah.
I think it's tried to be
Yeah.
clear with that.
It makes it sound like it is that the whole structure would be considered
Well,
the
that's-
detached
that's
ADU.
What it says, entire structure.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
One question. So in the code, when it says primary residence, the primary structure, are you saying the definition from what we have is the first building built? Then is that what we take as the primary structure?
Correct. Uh-huh. The first home that was built on the property that meets the setbacks for a primary residence.
So that's all the definition of the primary is just that, just
Mhm.
the order which it was built.
Not necessarily, it's a primary use as well. So an accessory building cannot be built until a primary home is built first. It's accessory to the primary. So
Mm.
primary residence has to be there first before you can build an accessory building to the primary use. Okay, so the home that was there first is the primary residence. The accessory building comes afterwards.
And in this case, the home, the 8 bedrooms or whatever you said was the first building built. And so
Correct.
that,
Any other comments? Any other questions? I need to get a sense from the commission. You think we should grant this conditional use permit or not? From my opinion, because of the intent, which is hard to go through, but also because of the size, I would have to say no.
The intent, you mean the intended use?
Yeah,
But I think
But
that's not.
that's not something we
Okay,
can,
all right,
but
Okay.
so I have to look at the sizes here, and I think it's more than we say it can be for me, but let's hear what the rest of you have to say.
How do we get objective evidence of the square footage of that building?
You could have a formal determination made by an appraiser. Or have the original floor plan that was submitted for building permit brought to the city to verify. Again, our building
Well, I
department
don't,
doesn't
it's,
have
it's
that.
not even close enough that you need that. It's
Yeah. that's
It's
true.
way over.
between 35 and 3,800 square feet.
Yeah, just based on the
Okay.
GIS measurements you made. Yeah.
So I'm sensing,
For
Make
me,
a
I'm not
motion.
in favor of it.
okay,
So I'll make a motion.
all right, we're ready to make a motion.
Yeah.
Go
If I
for
may,
it.
real quick, commissioners, on a decision such as this, be very clear about your findings of fact, okay?
Yep.
Okay,
So I make a motion that we do not is that we do not grant the conditional use permit based on section 12, well, we'll just go North Logan Municipal Code 12C-515.2. Section 3. That it does not, it's larger than the structure is larger than the maximum gross area of 1,500 square feet.
which is in our code.
I'll second that motion.
Okay, Marie, it's been moved by Jeff. Do I have to repeat all of that again? And
So well spoken.
it was so well done. Seconded by Karen, that we do not grant a conditional use permit for this property. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. There you have it.
Okay, thank you for your consideration, commissioners.
Can I do this thing?
Yeah, go ahead. 3 times.
3 times. Okay, let's move on to number 3. Work session discussion regarding a city initiated text amendment to the subdivision development standards for the RE5 zone. Scott.
Okay, commissioners, we're changing from a administrative item to a legislative item. This is a work session on a hypothetical amendment to our code. Okay. We'll give a minute to clear out here and I'll pull up some information on this.
Thank you. We're not talking about short-term rentals tonight. We're talking about accessory dwellings. And that's what we had to work with tonight.
But we can, but by not granting bigger concern.
So, Mr.
Kendrick.
No, no,
Mr.
we're talking about
Hopkins.
Section 3.
We're moving on to number 3. Thank you for attending.
Okay, commissioners. So there's some history on this text amendment. The reason why we are even talking about this is because of a past concept and subdivision that was proposed up in the Hidden Hollow area above Wildercrest. I'm going to open up a subdivision plat that had received approvals back in the 2008-ish timeframe. Okay, so here's the Wildercrest area down here. Currently, the road for this area ends about here. It's a cul-de-sac at the top of the hill. And there was a proposal to have additional lots kind of skirt the hillside here in the remaining, somewhat achievable buildable area as far as slope is concerned. Long story short, the economy took a nosedive in 2008 and the developer never did move forward with this plan. It expired, wasn't recorded. Okay. We have been in communication with that particular developer and there's some history. We wanted to kind of run you through a bullet pointed list of this history. And we have Nick Porter with us, who was involved in some of those decisions back in the day and is working with the landowner now to potentially move forward with adjusting a few things in our code to allow for some development in the area based on some previous considerations that were erroneous. I'm not doing justice to this, but Nick, would you like to give us this quick synopsis, as you're a little bit more familiar than maybe I know myself and some of these commissioners on the board here?
Yeah, Nick Porter, developer on Hidden Hollow.
Nick, if you want me to pull up that previous map, let me know how
Yeah,
you want to describe.
Yeah, why don't we bounce over to Bonneville Trails? So 3 developers came to the city, Alan Steed, Bruce Nelson, Jim Maloof. Each 3 of those owned a different piece of this. Alan Steed owned what is now Meadowlark Lane. Bruce Nelson owns that section right there, and then Jim Maloof, this southern section. They came in, they got this approved, it was entitled, they recorded phase 1. It's Meadowlark Lane today. Like Scott's saying, you can drive up it, steepest road in North Logan. There's a little dirt cul-de-sac at the top. And Bruce Nelson and Jim Maloof did not pursue theirs. That was the time frame. It was 2008. Alan didn't do great on phase 1, and the other guys didn't do phase 2 and phase 3. As you all know, even though you have entitled property, if you don't record the plat after a certain time, that entitlement goes away. And that's exactly what happened. Originally, all of that property, all of Bonneville Trails Estates, the entire thing was zoned RE1, which is consistent with what all of Canyon Ridge is. During that time, the city, in order to approve Bonneville Trail Estates, they needed more water up there. And so they made those 3 developers pay for Beef Hollow 2 is the technical name of that tank. If you go back to that thing, Scott, so the tank is like up here. If you look out your window, look at this highest spot up there right before the mountainside goes, there's this giant fence around a little outhouse thing. That's the water tank. So Jim Maloof at the same time was developing Canyon Ridge phase 3. So that's like Naomi Circle, that chunk. Wow. This is Naomi Drive, Naomi Circle. This is like phase 3 of Canyon Ridge. Because Jim Maloof was developing Canyon Ridge and he was developing Bonneville Trail Estates, he paid a disproportionate, or his proportionate amount of that water tank. And that water tank was installed there for those 60 homes for Bonneville Trail Estates and Canyon Ridge phase 3. That's why that water tank exists. Now, fast forward, 2008 hits, time flies by, things happen, they don't move forward with it, Bruce doesn't either. At some point, a single individual approached Jim Maloof and wanted to build one home on his 30 acres. That individual came into the city. I was not a part of that. I don't know what those conversations were. At some point, Jim Maloof didn't feel like it was, he didn't feel like it was right to put that many homes on the bench. And so he decided that he was okay doing a lesser dense project. And he was okay just letting one person put a home there.
I think 2 or 3 individuals ended up like drifting through the city and trying to put a home on there, and it just like didn't pan out for whatever reason. You can get those details from city officials. During those discussions, the city was reviewing their master plan, and there, if you go back to any one of those slides, so the city on their master plan had, this was shown on the master plan. Meaning if you develop that property, you have to install that master plan road. That's the way that works. So single individuals are coming in, they're looking at 30 acres, they're going to put one home. The city's looking at their master plan road. They're also looking at a bridge that goes over a ravine in this section. This is a giant ravine right here. So I think it's a combination of the landowner changing his idea of what the bench should see. It's a combination of individuals wanting to put one home there, and it's a combination of the city realizing they don't want a road there anymore, and they don't want 60 homes. It was Bonneville Trail Estates. So the city decided to rezone this property. They decided to rezone it from RE1 to RE5, meaning you're getting you're upzoning your property, which nobody upzones their property. Like, this is literally the only like, nobody in the history of North Logan has upzoned their property except for this parcel. Look it up. That's not a thing. Nobody does that.
So
But
just to
they
be
did
clear,
it.
Nick, on the terminology, just the planning commissioner's learning, it's actually down zoning. Up zoning is when you increase your
Down
density.
zoning, sorry.
Nobody
We
down
know
zones.
we know what you meant.
You were down zoning your property. So
That doesn't make sense. Sort of it does.
It's kind of backwards. hey?
Buzzy was on the planning commission at the time this went through.
So I think just to clarify, the intent here was we had 30 acres of land. If it was zoned RE1, you'd get a lot more lots on this property, right? But you'd have to put in this extremely expensive road, right? And there's engineering and cost, it just didn't come to fruition. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Nick, but the idea being we would remove that master plan road from our planning documents in exchange for a down zone. We would reduce the density. They could potentially put some homes up there, the intent being around 6 or 7 homes, but that full road wouldn't go in.
And on
Correct
minimum.
me if I'm wrong here. I've
that-
only been with the city a couple months and I'm learning.
No, that's
fast.
correct.
5-acre lots, it's already 5.
So, yeah,
Well,
Well,
it's complicated.
Yeah.
so when Jim Maloof
everything
was
is-
having these discussions, he was like, okay, I have 35 acres. We're doing RE5, 5-acre lots. I can still get, 6, 7 homes there. I'm okay with that. So he didn't show up to the meetings. He was okay with this. There was like a gentleman's agreement with the city that you were still going to get that number of homes on there. The individuals that wanted to put a single home there, they drifted out of the picture. I drifted into the picture. I started to develop this property. I sat down with Spencer Burt. We started going through the code. We found a section of code that would prevent us from putting like more than 1 to maybe 2 homes on here. And it was like super deflating, and it like, nobody had malintent. I want to be really clear on that. It was just, nobody has 10,000 pages of North Logan City Code memorized. It's just not a thing. Nobody does. You guys included, like, just Jeff kind of does. Jeff's close.
I'd like to say I'm getting close.
And Scott's there
I think
too. And I
Scott
think
does.
Alan probably 5 years ago did. Shy of those 3 people that weren't part of these discussions, there was a section of code that prevented that. This whole push by the city is an attempt to align the city code with what the city told a property owner. And I really value that. I think it says a lot about the city, and I'm like thankful I live in an area where even though everything isn't always in writing, people had intent of what the discussions were. And then when you find out it wasn't in writing, like to go back and then put it in writing, I think says everything. I'm thankful for everybody's time involved in this. It's been hundreds of hours at this point over, many members of planning commission and city council to get to this point. So
Nick, thanks for providing some back history. What we're looking at here is a city initiated text amendment. Now, the applicant could come forward and request to do this text amendment as well, but the city views this as, there's a desire to work in good faith to get our code back to where they could do something similar to what the original intent was, which was instead of 16 homes, it was 6 to 7. But unbeknownst to everybody, there's a statement in the code, especially in the RE5 zone, that prohibits you from using any of your acreage that is undevelopable, whether it's sensitive lands or swamp or whatever, that you can't utilize that in your calculation for your lots. And so given these properties here, specifically these two lots, we got 2.6 acres and 28.25, so a little bit over 30 acres. A large percentage of it is extremely steep or covered in these difficult to develop areas, this ravine, for example. And so if they were to take those 30 acres, divide that by 5, they could get 6 lots, but because of the undevelopable area, you can't. And that was the section of code that nobody at the time recognized being an impediment to their ability to develop those 6 acres under the RE5 zone, which is what we zoned this property to from RE1. So the owner, did not expect that to be the case. Otherwise, he would have, objected to the rezoning at the time. So what we're looking at is potentially making some very strategic amendments to the code to allow for development in our RE5 zone, which is very limited, by the way. We only have a couple of parcels that are zoned as such. Let me show you here. Okay, so this parcel, so these couple of parcels up here are what we're looking at as RE5. It changes to RE1 once you get up to this area here.
So it's already zoned RE5 right now.
We zoned it.
parcel we're
Yep,
talking about.
these ones that are in question, these particular down here, which are the parcels that Nick represents. There are a few other ownership interests up here that could benefit from some of these adjustments as well. But what we're looking at, if we were to adjust our code for RE5, this is the only place in town where it would be applicable. Okay, so I know we're getting short on time. There is a red line document that we can review tonight, or we can review at our next meeting and work session in more detail. But the intent, as you read through those red lines, is to specifically strike the requirement to reduce your developable acreage by the unbuildable areas. So instead of calculating your buildable lots off of the buildable area, you're calculating it off of the gross acreage, not the net after you pull out all of the undevelopable areas. The intent being the result of such a text amendment would allow for a subdivision to go forward that would look more like this. Zoom in here. So in this particular configuration, there's 7 lots here. We don't think we're going to get 7. We think we'll probably get 6. This particular lot here has limited access, and it's just not going to happen. But all this acreage up on the hillside, we would technically have to cut out of the density calculation, and very little of that area could be left in that density determination. So as we look at these code amendments, that's the intent. There's some history here where the city acted in good faith with unintended consequences. We'd like to act in good faith again and try to amend and cure that unintended consequence. You guys have any questions on the area or the history?
Can we get input? The woman in the back, did you have, looked like you were waving. Is that allowed, Scott? Can we get her in?
This is a work session, so the chairman would have to choose to have some public comment.
Sure, quickly, please.
Sorry. I would just like, so my name is Alexis Alt, and I'm a resident of North Logan. my property is adjacent to this parcel of land, and there's a long history that is not being discussed here today about concerns about development, the development that's being proposed here in terms of safety and land surface hazards. I want to say that there were some issues about the timeline. I was at some of those planning commission and city council meetings where removal of the road was being discussed, for example, and that was voted to have that removed. That was not tied to any gentleman's agreement or any elements of rezoning. That was a decision that was being made. So I feel like things are being linked here that, if my memory is correct, that was done, for example, Sid Crookston did not want that road going through there, and he spoke at this lectern. So I think, I'm not sure about some of the associations that are being made here. The other question that I have is, if you're not going to take into consideration, and I'm just hearing this for the first time, but does the issue of how unbuildable space is used in determining lot size extend to RE1? Do you have that same consideration? Is it only RE5?
So this particular proposal, if we were to move forward with any proposal, would be to only limit that to the RE5 zone. The other zones require you to pull that area out of the calculation. So if you've got, let's say, 10 acres in a 1 acre zone and 5 of it is determined to be undevelopable, you would just have 5 acres and 5 lots instead of 10 lots. Your end result in doing that calculation is 5 lots, just for quick math. That's not what is part of this particular proposal.
Right, but I guess what I'm saying is, are you setting a precedent here for code change that extends to how other zones and future development, for example, to the north of this, where there's been plans in the past to build
With RE1.
155 homes, you're setting a precedent for how you determine the lots and how many lots can fit in there. I understand that the only RE5 is this particular area. But this would represent a way in which the lot sizes are determined that could be extended to other zones. So I just think that there are other considerations here as well. I mean, I understand what's happening here, and I understand why Nick wants to do this. I do, and I understand why Jim Maloof wants to do this. But there are broader issues about lack of safety, for speaking of snowplows, safety, broader issues of water in this whole area that haven't been resolved and are not going to be resolved, like with that tank. That's why you all know the water issues in this. So just to say that there are other issues that I think there's just more thought that needs to go into this.
Thank you, Alexis.
Thank you. Thank you.
So a couple of clarifications here. What we were proposing is a text amendment that would just adjust how we calculate density. What would happen there, if this amendment goes through as it's intended, the developer would still have to submit for a subdivision. All of those safety concerns, engineering concerns, access, steep roads, all those would have to be addressed before it could even be approved. We're just trying to get our regulatory language to a position to where, if they had the engineering and everything figured out and the access to this area figured out, then they could submit a subdivision application, which would have to meet all of those standards in safety and engineering and geology. All those, questions would be addressed at that time.
What metrics do you use to determine whether land is developable or not? Slope.
Yeah, slope. 30% generally is the target. Anything under 30% is
Grade.
Generally, yes, your grade.
That's the only metric you're using is grade.
There's geologic concerns as well, and access to
Like massive rock.
Grade and drainage, you said?
Yeah, where your stormwater and your runoff would need to go. There's metrics that we would have to measure, and as we look at a subdivision proposal, we would look at areas that are undevelopable, and they still can develop in those areas. We're just simply saying that acreage can be used in the calculation to determine the number of lots they can get out of a particular parcel.
So,
Go ahead.
yeah, this isn't an easy one. And I've been on lots of the meetings with Nick. We're like good friends now. Or not or something.
Something.
But I've always struggled with this one because the intent of all the parties involved early on were good intentions. So I have always struggled, and I've been very clear with Nick that the reason that I opposed the rezone was because I could. Because it's one of the few legislative things that I get to do. Because of all of the other concerns that are brought up, and so I have always really I've struggled with it because I felt like all the parties had good intents. I wasn't, I hate the idea of just making a quick exception because of precedents. So I'm keenly aware of that. I'm probably open to consideration on this one because it makes right what the intent originally was. And it's easy to tie it to RE5 because this is really the only section in the city that it
apply
would
to.
write that.
Mhm.
But I'm very, very concerned about all of the other things that we always brought up in all the meetings before, but I am open to I'm not one that generally likes to just make whimsical changes.
Yep.
To rezones, code, or anything else. But my personal opinion, having been through a lot of meetings regarding this, I always felt like all the parties had good intentions, and unfortunately some language in there caught the parties up, and so I'm kind of in favor of trying to write that, but there are a lot of other things that make this a challenging project for me.
Yeah.
So what would be the benefit to the city to change this? Explain that in clear terms to us.
If we were to leave this be, the benefit to the city, I think the better benefit is if we don't change anything, there's no development up here, there's no roads to maintain, but that's maybe a selfish way to not do something about something that we had good intentions about in the past. The benefit is just to uphold the integrity of the city in one breath. Benefit to the city. I think that's the crux of why this is even before us, is just trying to work in good faith and to, uphold our good business attitude, I guess you would say. Yeah.
And this is the only R5 zone that
This
we have?
is, yep. As far as precedent is concerned, this is a text amendment. It's legislative. The city has broad deference in their decision-making when it comes to a legislative amendment. And we're not bound to do something similarly just because we did something similarly in the past. But, the idea is out there on the table. Well, you allow it in the RE5 zone. Cache County, for example, I was reading their agenda a little while ago. They're having a very similar conversation about how do we calculate density, sensitive lands. We are not the first municipality to have this type of a question and a concern, but every municipality chooses differently. Some just say, no, we're just going to look at the gross, and undevelopable areas are just going to be labeled as such on the plat. So we make sure there's no homes in those undevelopable areas. But as far as the density calculation, they leave it as gross. Other communities, Weber County, where I came from, they did have a net type of a calculation where we would subtract out the right of way, would subtract out all of the undevelopable area, and then what's left is what you then divide by the acre size for the lots. So it's local preference. And I think the preference here for the city is that we just correct the wrong that was unintended.
I've got a question, Scott. Is this precedential?
I don't believe it is, given the fact that it's legislative. I think the only precedent, like I had mentioned, is saying, hey, well, you have it somewhere else in your code for another zone. Why not consider it for another zone? But the city can say, because that wasn't the intent, and we're not obligated to follow any precedent.
I think most of us on this commission right now are not in those preliminary meetings, so.
Yep.
I'm struggling with that too.
There are
on something was I didn't have any part of it.
There are some on our commission as well as on the city council that were present during those discussions. So there is some historical knowledge. And then also here with us in the form of staff. So it's not that we're making this decision with, half the story. We have the story amongst the minds, but I think it's just a matter of putting together a text amendment that is specific enough to allow, for the intent to be corrected, but it doesn't necessarily have to fall over into other areas of town.
Do you know how we can get access to the information on the concerns that were maybe touched on at a high level here, but that we could maybe get a little more detail on to inform ourselves?
I'm sure we could.
I'm guessing it's water and roadway and.
So, Alexa, right? Alexis. To speak to Alexis and Jeff's comments, there are concerns with development on this. I'm not going to stand here and say there's not. Like, you can go back and read like tons of history on this, but I think there's a million checks and balances, right? Like if you approve this language, what you're approving is holding the integrity of the city and holding the integrity of like what was there was a meeting of the minds. Both parties walked away thinking 5, 6, 7 homes would be here, and the code is preventing that. So that's what we're trying to resolve tonight, is that specific issue. By you approving this language, I don't get to go do this tomorrow. Like, there's such a long process where Alexis can come in and has come in many times. And we can talk about all the specific concerns with that. But in my mind, they're two totally separate things. One is restoring the property rights to an owner, and the other is, okay, you have those property rights, but we still have safety concerns, water concerns, ingress and egress concerns,
geological
concerns, soil concerns, like all of those concerns. At some point, we will come in and we'll address those. And if they fit what the city of North Logan and what planning commission and city council wants to see here, well, great, let's do it. But we can't even get to that point unless we resolve this issue. And one of the things while I was sitting there, last thing I'll say, I know we're running late, but like this idea that there's going to be a precedent set. Well, the precedent that you're setting is, yeah, if the city tells you something and a lot of people are involved in that, and then we walk away and then we find on page 10,001 in the fine print, like, we're going to stand by that. So if somebody comes in with the RE1 and wants to put 7 million homes north of here, and the city promised them that 45 years ago, and it's all well documented, well then, yeah, you should probably like uphold that. But if not, what argument do they have? Our argument is very clear. Like, nobody's denying that this happened. Now we're just trying to fix it. And by fixing it, you're not endorsing 6 homes here. You're not. What you're endorsing is the city of North Logan is going to have integrity and follow through with what they said they're going to. And then we're going to come in and talk about these 6 homes. And if I have concerns about those, well, we're going to address those.
So just so the commission's clear on what the issue was. So what's preventing them is because of the steepness of part of the land itself. In order to dice this up in the calculation to determine how many lots you can put on there, we have to exclude a significant portion of it because of the steepness of, right. And so the request is, let's amend that language on this zoning to not have.
So if it wasn't changed, it would limit the number of homes that could be built on the front. Is that correct?
Correct.
Correct.
Instead of 5, you get 3.
I don't know. 3 is something here next on the map.
1 to 2.
1 to 2.
You get 1 to 2 on 30 plus acres. One of the other things that I'll just mention really quick, we're not proposing to put homes on 30-degree slopes. That's not what we're proposing. In previous meetings, we kind of got bogged down with that. if you look at this, if you look at these lines, this is topo lines. This grade right here is the same thing as Alexis's home. And the same thing as this home and other homes here. The steep stuff is right here. We're not trying to put homes way up there, like on, like the slope is like this and then it goes like this. This is the section, we're not talking about putting a home there. These pads are still massive compared to what's around them.
One more comment.
Yes, and I understand, I mean, basically, the thing is that it's issues related to rezone, which is the only place that breaks go on this process. Because once the rezone happens, then I have been told by members of the planning commission and by city council that it was a rezone before, or now we're gonna change the way in which 5 is zoned. This is the only way that there's breaks on this process until issues related to water are resolved and et cetera. So I just wanted to highlight why I would be even here when I saw this on the agenda to speak, because it matters. The other thing I would say is, just with all due respect about the topography, these topo lines are not doing justice. And yes, my house is there. You're right. This great point about right here and what the slope is over here. Fair. But some of the other parts of these lots, and perhaps you would not put a home there, but let's just look right here. Same massive epic drainage that has seen huge debris flows. There's boulders perched on it. How are the people over those lots going to access that? In a previous version of this, there was a road that was drawn, and I appreciate that now there's only a cul-de-sac, but that cul-de-sac is squarely in an epic drainage. And I know this land, and I'm just saying that this is a complicated space to develop. And when I see plans like this with a cul-de-sac basically placed on top of an epic drainage, like you can see there's those topo lines immediately adjacent to it. It doesn't instill me with confidence that this subdivision is going to be developed carefully, because you can do stuff like this and put lines on a map, but then you can go out there and stand there and go, oh my goodness. So that's why there's a concern. I recognize that in the future, this will probably be developed, right? It's just going to happen. I just have concerns about the way in which it's going about happening. And now it's like, okay, well, we'll try to change the code.
Okay.
Commissioners, a couple of just observations here. If this text amendment goes forward and we, try to, restore these property rights, as Nick had mentioned, that gives them the right to move forward with proposing a subdivision. However, he would have to come with his army of engineers to prove how it could be designed in a safe and efficient manner that meets standards. And if they can't prove that, if there is in fact a cul-de-sac right in the middle of a drainage and there's just no way to engineer that, then they would be limited on, design. Maybe they don't get 6 lots at the end of the day based on how they can engineer around the problems that are present. So just to reiterate, this is a text amendment. It's not a rezone, but it does allow for some engineers to scratch their heads a bit and see if they can design something that can meet code. Also, an important note here, this particular drawing is just conceptual, high level, for just to facilitate discussion. This is in no way a formal proposal. And before anything could move forward, even if we do make changes to the code, there's not adequate access to this subdivision. This is a landlocked archipelago of subdivided homes. Our current standards could not allow for this to move forward until additional points of egress are connected. So this is when and if those access points are resolved, when and if engineering can even propose something that meets standard. What we're talking about is just changing the code to where those property rights could be restored.
So basically that's it. We're going to decide whether we want to have the city uphold their honor or not. Is that kind of where we're at here?
Essentially, yeah. And there's a formal red line. It's a bit hairy to look at, but I don't know if you guys want to spend the time tonight or if we'd like to look at that in detail at another meeting. You guys let me know. Or if you'd like a minute to read over it before we dive into it, that's fine too.
Well, that's what I was gonna suggest, yeah.
Okay.
But tonight?
Another night, but I would like to, I'm kind of
I
with
wanna
Jeff,
take-
I don't want to make a hurried decision that might have unintended second and third order consequences without feeling like I'm informed, and I don't know
Sure.
if I feel like I'm informed totally
No.
right now.
No, the intention of this discussion right now is just to introduce you to the topic. We'll get
Okay.
into the weeds later.
We
Yep.
do appreciate. So we want to get a little more into the
Thank you.
weeds before we make it.
Absolutely.
Very helpful.
Okay, we'll put this on an agenda for, the next meeting or so where the red lines, you guys can read through them, and then I'll walk through them with you as well before we move forward. Sounds
Okay.
the plan?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's good with everyone? All right, how about planning commission training, land use decisions, proper procedures, due process rights?
Okay, you guys let me know, how late would you like to go tonight? I have some training materials. I do want to mention Commissioner Tyre, thank you very much for doing your training. So as everybody knows, every new planning commissioner has to have a full hour of training before they can participate on our board. And Commissioner Tyre did do her
Good for
Open
her.
and Public Meetings Act training. So thank you for doing that.
She's got more training than I
Good
do.
for
Yes, I have done that.
Yep. Okay, do you want to jump in? You want to spend some time on this or?
Scott, can we do it for till 8:30 and then be done?
Sure. Yeah,
Okay,
let's
that
talk
okay?
about.
you voted me in 8:30, then we'll be done. How's that?
Sounds good.
Closed and everything, 8:30.
Or before 8:30. that's
Okay.
I wish that it opened in a better viewable format. Download. Okay, so one thing that there's two topics I wanted to discuss with you. The first was proper process of making land use decisions, and then also what's called due process rights of an applicant. Okay, I have two different presentations. We'll try to get through this first one, and then we'll have additional discussion on the other one. But this requirement stems all the way back to the Constitution and some of the what they call the Reconstruction amendments that occurred after the Civil War, 1865 through 1870. There are three amendments to the Constitution following the war to reconstruct and to reestablish a few things. So the first, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 14th, every American is a citizen. Basically, all the enslaved peoples were then naturalized as citizens with equal protections. And then 15, no one could be denied voting privileges. So those were part of that Reconstruction period after the Civil War. But what we want to talk about specifically is the 14th Amendment, because it actually trickles down to our land use decisions. But the very first section of this amendment reads, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without the due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And it's amazing how much you can pack into a little piece of language. Once you dissect all of this, it gets extremely complex, and there's entire lawyers that devote their career to just one of these sentences, right? So important points here. The citizenship, obviously, to formerly enslaved people, big, high level thing that amendment addressed. The second, ensure due process of law, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And property is kind of where we start making decisions that affect people's property rights, right? So we cannot make any decisions that deprive them of their property rights without due process of law. And then lastly, equal protection under the law. So nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of laws. As in, we're applying the laws equally to everybody. It's a level playing field. At least that was the intent. Okay, just to further drill down on this, per the 14th Amendment, due process is a fundamental constitutional guarantee that all legal proceedings will be fair and that one will be given notice of the proceedings and an opportunity to be heard before the government acts to take away one's life, liberty, or property. So even just tonight with this conditional use permit, we followed a very specific process. We issued public notices 10 days in advance. We notified them of a public hearing. We allowed the public to speak. We allowed the applicant to speak. We reviewed the facts. We made specific findings before we acted. as a body to, in this instance, take away a property right from that applicant. So that's in the Constitution of the United States. The state of Utah, the Constitution of the state of Utah also has this language in Article 1, Section 7. So it kind of trickles down from the federal to the state level there. Okay, there's a separation between due process on the procedural side and then the substantive side. On the procedural side, it requires the government to follow fair procedures before depriving a person of life, liberty, or property. We've kind of talked about that. The biggest question when we make our decisions is, did we follow the procedures that are spelled out to us in state code and local ordinance? If we didn't follow that process, then the applicant could actually appeal and say, hey, you guys didn't hold a hearing. You know, I was deprived of my due process rights. You guys need to go back and have that before you can take away my property rights. Okay. And then on the other side, the substantive side, it requires the government, all governmental intrusions into fundamental rights and liberties to be fair and reasonable and in furtherance of a legitimate governmental interest. So is our action justified? Was our action unreasonable? Was it arbitrary or was it capricious? Are we just willy-nilly throwing out requirements that have nothing to do with the request? It's almost like saying, you guys want to have a short-term rental, go and build a road over here for us, and then we'll consider that, or something that isn't even reasonably related, right? It needs to be associated with the decision. Okay, I'm going to skip over this part. This is the Utah Land Use Institute. You guys have seen their publications. I think you guys have read some of this. Ground rules. This is a product or a book written by Utah Land Use.
What? Heather read it backwards to forwards already. It's on your
You guys haven't memorized yet?
Jeff has it memorized too.
Yeah.
I already read it.
So for us, as local officials, we can protect due process rights by following the following steps. So notice, every type of decision requires some type of a noticing. A lot of the decisions that we make only require that the agenda be posted 24 hours in advance. But there's other types of applications like this conditional use permit that we had that required us to notice the neighbors within 600 feet at least 10 days in advance. That's unique to that decision type. Not every decision type has that notice requirement, but our process says send out a notice, 10 days in advance. So we followed that noticing requirement. Hold a public hearing if such a hearing is required. Not all discussions and decisions require a public hearing. This one did. Okay. But at the hearing, we need to make sure that the applicant has a reasonable opportunity to be heard. So we can't just say, sorry, you're not going to speak to this. We'll make a decision based on what's in front of us without any dialogue. And also, if applicable, the public needs to be heard if a public hearing is required for any decision type. Okay, we can't just make decisions in a vacuum. And then evidence, always provide a reasonable opportunity for the applicant to respond to evidence presented to the decision maker and or land use authority.
But so my one point also is, if it's not a public hearing, we don't have to hear anybody say anything.
So
right?
The process that we have will tell us, do we have to hold a hearing or not? In our conditional use ordinance, there's a sentence that very specifically says, for most of these conditional use permits, you don't have to have a public hearing. The commission can, in their own decision, say, we want to have a public hearing. And so we have the opportunity to hold one if we so choose. With detached accessory dwelling units, there's actually a section very specific to that decision type that says, for this one, you do have to notice the public, you do have to have a public hearing. Which is unique, but that's the process that's spelled out in our code. And that's a process we have to follow to protect that the applicant's due process rights. As far as evidence is concerned, we need to present the evidence and give them the opportunity to discuss and to clarify the evidence that is being weighed on their decision. Okay, conflicts of interest, ex parte communications, and bias. This is all things that can deprive an applicant of their due process rights. So if you have a conflict of interest and you don't disclose that conflict and you participate in the discussion, that could deprive them of their due process rights because you're making a decision with a conflict of interest. Ex parte communications. This is specifically important when we're talking about administrative items. When it comes to legislative items, it's a little bit different because we have broad deference. You know, we get to talk to our constituents, we can talk to the public, we can have, you know, discussions to say, what do you think about this policy? Is it a good idea or not? What are its merits? What are its detractors? But on an administrative item, you guys have a very specific, narrow scope of review. Does it meet the standards? Yes or no? But if we have ex parte communications and things like that, it kind of changes your mindset and how you might vote on a particular item. And then bias. Everyone has biases, but it's our job to set those aside and make sure we're voting with the best intent for the public or for the city or for whoever is before us. Try to keep your bias out of the decision. Okay. This is particularly interesting. I've given you guys a couple of links here if you want to read more on it, but the Open and Public Meetings Act, there's the chapter in Title 52. Here's the training that you guys are supposed to do on an annual basis that Commissioner Tyre just finished. Thank you for doing that. And here's just kind of a leaflet if you want to read through some kind of one-liners, but this is funny. The Planning Commission rezone, public hearing, and then we've got pitchforks and torches. They happen sometimes, but it's our job as a board to hold due process even through these challenging meetings. Okay.
Scott, real quick with the Utah Open Meetings Act training.
Yep.
I thought we did that a couple months
You
ago. I
did.
thought you said we wouldn't have to do, or we should seek out other training that's not redundant, but
I
you're
think
saying
you're
we should do
right.
that annually.
I think it's good to do annually. Yeah. If it's been like 2 months, maybe wait until
it's been
October to do
like-
it again.
Only a couple months for some of us, 'cause we weren't told.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll probably
Since
just get it out of the way
juveniles
right now.
needed.
Honestly,
got it
when you look at the training requirements throughout the year, it doesn't explicitly say you take this particular training as a 1 hour prerequisite for your year. It doesn't say you have to do it every single year, but you have 4 hours of training. This is probably the most important training that you guys do just to ensure you run an open and public meeting efficiently. Because if we don't, then you open yourselves up for scrutiny, you know, with challenges in district court and things like that.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Scott.
Scott, are there, we
Um,
have a listing of the
Do we have this available, this training?
It's online.
Do we
This
have-
this PowerPoint's in the
It is.
directory for today.
It is.
Okay.
Yep, I dropped it in today, so if you looked before, it wasn't there, but you're welcome to go and hop in there and grab it.
Hey. Any more staff business?
I do have one item of business on the storage unit discussion we've been working through the last several months. The city council and mayor have requested that we make a decision on that item at our next meeting. So what they're asking us to do is to weigh the merits of the proposal as it's currently drafted and vote based on your feelings with the current text. Make a recommendation, hold a public hearing. The city council would like to look at it in its current form with your recommendation as it's currently drafted. So with that direction, we'll put it on the agenda. We'll notice for a public hearing. We'll hold that hearing based on the language and then have you guys vote based on your feelings on how it's drafted. Now, that could be a split vote. It could be a negative recommendation. It could be a positive recommendation, but at any rate, the city council would like to see that proposal and weigh it as it's currently drafted. Okay, so just an FYI.
And that would be next meeting?
That would be our next meeting, which is on the 16th.
Okay.
I've got it researched.
February, 16th of February, everybody.
Yep.
All right. Anybody else have any business? Thank you. Thank you, Scott, for getting us through this and
Yeah.
for that training.
Yeah, and one other thing real quick, commissioners, I appreciate your guys' work to work through the facts of that conditional use permit. That's tough. And as I can also appreciate, you don't always have to agree with staff's opinion. You know, sometimes my interpretation of something isn't the same as how you read it, and that's great. That's why we have multiple minds reading the same language. So I applaud your willingness to go through the details and make a decision based on unique findings of your own. So thank you for doing that.
It's nice to have the code in front of us too.
Yeah.
I
it's-
mean,
Yeah, it is
Your
so
staff
helpful.
reports are awesome. Thank you for putting those together.
That's a good question.
It's terrible.
Yeah. And that's,
It is ambiguous, yeah.
You know, I am happy if that is something you would like for us to look at. What I would do is I would forward that information to the city council and say, hey,
Yeah.
guys, here's the decision that was made on the planning commission. It was tough based on the language that we have. And, you know, if they say you're probably right, go ahead and take a look at it, spend the time and effort to do so. Then we could do, you know, a text amendment to
I
maybe
feel like
clean
if
some of that up.
y'all had some sort of lack of clarity on it all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which then made it.
And you know what's tough is when we don't have clear code and we make a decision based on the code that we have, the applicant could appeal that. They
right.
could appeal that to our, you know, appeal board, and the appeal board would be tasked with reviewing our code
Mhm.
and either agreeing with your interpretation of it or not. And if they remand it back to us, then, you know, we might have another discussion on this topic.
Right.
We'll see.
Okay.
There's a
Oh,
lot of
yeah,
things.
It's heavy.
There's a
Great.
lot in the
We,
code that,
we, we should say
contradicts
we
itself.
do know that and we recognize it in each of our meetings. that We're seeing that.
I appreciate it.
Okay.
You know,
You don't want to ask us because we don't know,
I-
we're about
I'm
to adjourn
happy-
too.
I'm happy to sit down with you and talk about it though.
I'll listen.
All
to you
right.
after.
Yeah,
Just
But-
close the meeting and then.
we just need a motion to close our meeting.
I so move.
Second.
All right, moved and Jeff seconded to close our meeting. All in favor?
Aye.
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 All right, thank you, everybody.